Please pretend you're my grandson.
The highway stretched out like a ribbon of faded black tar beneath Vincent Callahan's wheels, endless and empty under the vast Nevada sky. Mile after mile of desert scrub and distant mountains painted in shades of rust and shadow, the kind of landscape that made a man feel both insignificant and strangely free at the same time. Vincent rode alone the way he'd ridden for the past 3 years, just him and the iron horse beneath him, a 2019 Harley Road King with close to 90,000 miles on the odometer, and enough road dust in its chrome to tell 1,000 stories. The engine's deep rumble was the only conversation he needed most days, a steady mechanical heartbeat that filled the silence where human voices used to be. The sun was dropping low on the western horizon now, painting the desert in copper and gold, and Vincent could feel the temperature starting to fall. November in Nevada meant cold nights even after warm days, and he could see storm clouds gathering in the distance like dark bruises spreading across the pale sky. Rain was coming. He could smell it on the wind, that particular scent of moisture meeting dry earth that meant the desert was about to get washed clean, whether it wanted to or not. He'd been riding since Dawn left the motel in Barstow before first light, with nothing but black coffee in his belly and the open road ahead. Heading north on Highway 50, that lonely stretch they called the loneliest road in America, and Vincent figured that was fitting. He'd felt pretty lonely himself these past 3 years, ever since Catherine closed her eyes for the last time in that hospital room in Lexington and left him standing there with nothing but her cold hand in his, in a future that suddenly looked like a wall of fog with no lights to guide him through it. The Iron Wolves were gathering in Reno for a memorial ride. One of their brothers, a man they'd called Wrench on account of his genius with anything mechanical, had gone down on the interstate 2 weeks back. Pickup truck didn't see him change lanes without looking, and Wrench never had a chance. 73 years old and still riding, still living free, and then bodied in an instant. The club was meeting to ride together one last time in his honor, to let the sound of their engines be the eulogy that mattered, because Wrench wouldn't have wanted speeches and flowers. He'd have wanted the open road and the brotherhood and the win. Vincent planned to be there. Wrench had been good people, the kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back or rebuild your transmission for the cost of a six-pack in some conversation. But Vincent was in no particular hurry to arrive, and he'd taken the long way, the slow way, stopping when he felt like it and riding when the mood struck. Time didn't mean much when you had nobody waiting for you at the end of the day. The storm clouds were closer now, rolling in fast the way they did out here in the open desert. Vincent could see lightning flickering inside them, brief electric veins of light that reminded him of the x-rays they'd shown him of Catherine's lungs, all those dark shadows spreading where healthy tissue used to be. He shook his head, pushing the memory away. 3 years and he still couldn't look at certain things without seeing her somehow, without feeling that hollow ache in his chest that never quite went away. The first drops of rain hit his face shield just as he spotted the lights up ahead. A small cluster of neon glow against the darkening sky, the universal beacon of civilization in empty places. A diner looked like one of those old-school roadside places that probably hadn't changed its menu or its decor since 1975. The sign out front flickered in pink and blue, partly burned out, reading Stargate Diner, where the lie had given up the ghost some time ago. Vincent wasn't particularly hungry, but the rain was picking up, and he didn't relish the idea of riding through a desert thunderstorm in the dark. Lightning out here could turn a motorcycle into a very uncomfortable lightning rod, and he'd seen enough ways to die in his 45 years that he didn't need to go looking for new ones. He signaled even though there wasn't another vehicle in sight, old habits from his coal mining days, when safety protocols meant the difference between going home and not going home, and pulled into the gravel parking lot. The Starlight Diner sat by itself on a small patch of flat ground surrounded by scrub brush and darkness. A few pickup trucks were parked out front, working vehicles with toolboxes in the beds and mud on the tires. Vincent's bike looked out of place among them, all chrome and black leather in a world of rusted steel and faded paint. But he'd stopped caring about fitting in a long time ago. He killed the engine and the sudden silence was startling, just the patter of rain on his helmet and the distant rumble of thunder. Vincent sat there for a moment, feeling the fatigue in his shoulders and lower back, the particular ache that came from 8 hours in the saddle. He wasn't as young as he used to be, though he was still strong, still carried the build of a man who'd spent 20 years swinging a pickaxe in Kentucky coal mines before his lungs started to protest and the doctors told him to find another line of work. That was 15 years ago now. He drifted west, found the Iron Wolves, found a life that made sense when nothing else did. Met Catherine at a diner, not unlike this one actually, her car broken down on the side of the road, and Vincent stopping to help because that's what you did for people. She'd smiled at him like he was something other than a rough-looking biker with oil under his fingernails, and somehow that smile had turned into coffee, and coffee had turned into dinner, and dinner had turned into 12 years of marriage that were the best thing Vincent Callahan had ever known. Until the cancer came and took her away 6 months after the diagnosis so fast he barely had time to understand what was happening before she was gone. Vincent pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his hair, brown shot through with gray, cut short because it was easier that way. His beard was thick and full more gray than brown now, and his face was weathered from years of sun and wind. He knew what he looked like. Knew that when people saw him, saw the leather vest with the iron wool patches stitched across the back, saw the tattoos running down both arms and the scars on his knuckles, they made up their minds about who he was before he ever opened his mouth. Dangerous, trouble, someone to avoid. And most days, Vincent didn't particularly care what people thought. He knew who he was. He knew he'd never raised his hand in anger against anyone who didn't deserve it, never stole anything that wasn't his, never lied when the truth would do. He'd worked honest jobs his whole life, paid his taxes, loved his wife with everything he had, and tried to be the kind of man his grandmother would have been proud of. The fact that he did all that while wearing leather and riding a motorcycle instead of wearing a suit and driving a sedan didn't change the fundamentals. The rain was coming down harder now, steady and cold, and Vincent swung his leg over the bike and headed for the diner's front door. The gravel crunched under his boots. Good heavy riding boots with steel toes that had saved his feet more than once when something heavy decided to fall. He pulled open the door and a little bell chimed above his head, cheerful and bright, completely at odds with the storm outside. The inside of the Starlight Diner was exactly what Vincent expected. Worn linoleum floors in a black and white checkerboard pattern, booths with cracked red vinyl seats, a long counter with round swivel stools and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly and made everything look slightly washed out. The air smelled like burnt coffee and frying bacon and some kind of pie, maybe apple. And underneath it all, the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaning products. There were maybe 6 other people inside. A truck driver slouched at the counter over a plate of eggs and hash browns, looking like he was fighting sleep and losing. 2 younger guys in work clothes sat in a booth near the window talking in low voices and occasionally glancing out at the storm. And behind the counter, a waitress in her late 40s with tired eyes and bottle blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wiping down the coffee station with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. She looked up when Vincent walked in and he saw the familiar flicker of assessment in her eyes. Saw her take in the leather vest, the patches, the sheer size of him filling the doorway, the beard that made him look more mountain man than businessman. Saw her decide, just like everyone always decided, that he was something to be cautious around. But she had a job to do, and to her credit, she didn't let her wariness show too much. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd grown up somewhere in the Midwest. "Sit anywhere you like. Coffee." "Please," Vincent said, and was vaguely surprised by how rough his own voice sounded. He hadn't talked to anyone since the gas station attendant that morning, and that had just been a nod and a fill it up. He cleared his throat. "Back booth, all right." "Sure thing." Vincent made his way to the corner booth in the back, the one with a view of both the front door and the rest of the diner. Old habits. Whether it was from his mining days when you always kept an eye on the exits in case something went wrong, or from his years with the wolves when sitting with your back exposed, was a good way to get surprised he couldn't say. Probably both. Either way, he slid into the booth and positioned himself where he could see everything, his back to the wall, and the whole room laid out in front of him. The waitress brought coffee in a thick white mug that had probably been washed a million times, set it down without ceremony, along with a plastic-coated menu that was sticky to the touch. "Kitchen closes in about 40 minutes, she said, "but if you want breakfast instead of dinner, that's fine. Cook doesn't care." "Thank you," Vincent said, and meant it. He wasn't sure what he wanted, wasn't sure he wanted anything at all really, but having options was better than not having them. The waitress nodded and moved away, and Vincent wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. Outside, the storm was picking up. Rain hammered against the windows in waves, and lightning flashed bright enough to momentarily turn everything outside into stark white and black shadows. Thunder followed seconds later, deep and rolling, the kind that you felt in your chest as much as heard. It was going to be a bad one. Vincent was glad he'd stopped when he did. He sipped the coffee. It was terrible, burnt and bitter, and probably sitting in the pot for hours, but it was hot and it was wet, and right now, that was enough. He found himself staring out at the storm, watching the rain slash across the parking lot lights, and his mind drifted the way it always did when he had nothing to occupy it. 3 years since Catherine died. Sometimes it felt like 3 lifetimes. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. He could still remember the exact moment the doctor came into that hospital room and told them there was nothing more they could do. Could still see the look on Catherine's face, the way she'd reached for his hand and held it tight and told him it was going to be okay, that he was going to be okay, even though she was the one dying. That was Catherine, always thinking about other people, always trying to take care of everyone around her, even at the very end. She'd asked him for one promise as the morphine started to make her drowsy: not to let her death shrink his world, not to let grief turn him into someone small and bitter and afraid. She'd touched his face with trembling fingers and told him the world needed men with strong backs and kind hearts, and that she'd fallen in love with both. Vincent had promised, because that's what you did when someone you loved asked you for something with their last bit of strength. But keeping that promise had been harder than he'd expected. He'd gone through the motions, kept riding with the wolves, kept his membership current, showed up for runs and events and the mandatory brotherhood gatherings. But his heart hadn't been in it. His heart hadn't been in much of anything, to be honest. He felt like he was watching his own life from a distance, going through the mechanics of existence without really participating in it. Eating when he was supposed to eat, sleeping when he was supposed to sleep, riding when he was supposed to ride, but never really feeling any of it. His brother Silas had tried to reach out after the funeral, called him every week for months, inviting him to visit, inviting him to church, telling him that faith could help heal the wounds that nothing else could touch. But Vincent hadn't wanted to hear it, hadn't wanted to hear about God's plan or the comfort of belief or any of it, because if God had a plan that involved taking Catherine away after only 12 years, when they were supposed to have 40 or 50, then Vincent wanted no part of that plan. They'd fought about it, him and Silas, said things that brothers shouldn't say to each other, and then they'd stopped talking altogether, and that had been 6 years ago now, and the silence between them had grown so heavy and thick that Vincent wasn't sure how to break it, even if he wanted to. The diner door chimed again. Vincent glanced up out of habit, the ingrained awareness that came from years of needing to know who was entering a room. What he saw made him sit up slightly, his attention sharpening. An elderly woman stumbled through the doorway, and stumbled was the right word. She wasn't walking so much as barely staying upright, one hand clutching the collar of a soaked wool coat that hung on her thin frame like it was 3 sizes too big. Her white hair was plastered to her skull, dripping rainwater onto the linoleum, and her face was pale, lips slightly blue from the cold. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Vincent's attention. It was her eyes, wide, terrified, darting around the diner like a trapped animal looking for an escape route or a place to hide. This wasn't someone who'd just gotten caught in the rain. This was someone who was running from something. Vincent felt something shift in his chest, some old instinct waking up after a long sleep. He'd seen fear before, seen it in the faces of miners when something went wrong underground and the lights went out, seen it in the faces of people who'd gotten on the wrong side of the wrong kind of trouble. This woman was genuinely frightened, and not just startled or uncomfortable, genuinely afraid for her safety. The waitress, whose name tag read Beth, Vincent noticed for the first time, started to move toward the woman with a concerned expression. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need—" But the elderly woman didn't seem to hear her. Her eyes were still scanning the diner, moving from person to person, the truck driver, the 2 work guys, Beth herself, and then landing on Vincent in the back booth, and stopping. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the length of the diner. Vincent saw her take in his appearance, the leather, the beard, the patches, the whole package that usually made people look away or cross the street. But instead of fear or disgust or the usual wariness, something else flickered across her face, something like recognition. Her eyes had gone to his hands, first wrapped around that coffee mug, then traveled up to his face, to the gray shot through his beard, to the lines around his eyes. And then, almost imperceptibly, her gaze had dropped to the wallet chain hanging from his belt, to the worn leather wallet itself, with its brass snap visible at his hip. Vincent followed her line of sight and understood with a start what she was seeing. The wallet Catherine had given him for their 5th anniversary, the one he'd never replaced. The one with the small photograph visible through the clear plastic window on the outside. A photo of Catherine laughing, her dark hair caught by wind, her eyes bright with life. The old woman's breath caught audibly, and Vincent saw tears well up in her eyes. Not tears of fear this time, but something else. Recognition. Memory. Loss. And then she started walking toward him. Not toward the counter, not toward the door, not toward Beth or anyone else in the diner. Directly toward Vincent, her steps unsteady but determined, like she'd made up her mind about something and was committed to seeing it through even if her body wanted to give out. Beth watched her go with a confused expression, and the truck driver lifted his head slightly, suddenly more alert. The two work guys stopped their conversation and turned to watch. Everyone in the diner was aware that something unusual was happening, that the normal script of elderly woman seeks help from waitress was being thrown out and replaced with something nobody expected. The woman reached Vincent's table and stopped gripping the edge of the booth with both hands like she needed it to stay standing. Up close, Vincent could see she was probably in her early 70s with a lined face that spoke of both age and stress, and eyes that were clear and intelligent despite the fear swimming in them. She was shaking whether from cold or fear, or both he couldn't tell, and her breathing was quick and shallow. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was so quiet Vincent had to lean forward to hear her. "Please, I need you to pretend you're my grandson." Vincent blinked, certain he'd heard her wrong. "Ma'am." Her eyes flicked again to the wallet at his hip, to Catherine's photograph, and her voice broke slightly. "Your wife, in the picture. She looks just like my daughter. My Sarah. Same smile. Same eyes. I saw it, and I thought." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, I know this is insane, but please." But before Vincent could respond, before he could process what she was saying about Sarah and Catherine, and the desperation in her voice, bright headlights swept across the front windows of the diner. Vincent's eyes flicked toward the glass, and he saw a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. A black Lincoln Continental, expensive and out of place, its headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. The old woman's entire body went rigid. Her hands tightened on the booth edge until her knuckles turned white, and a small sound escaped her throat, something between a whimper and a gasp. "He's here," she breathed, and there was pure panic in her voice, now barely controlled terror. "Please, just for a minute, please." Vincent's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand the situation he'd suddenly found himself in the middle of. Every instinct he had was screaming that something was very wrong here, that this woman was in genuine danger, that whatever was about to walk through that door was bad news. The Lincoln's engine cut off. A car door opened and closed, footsteps on gravel, quick and purposeful. Vincent looked at the old woman's face, really looked at it, and saw something there that made his decision for him. He saw the same kind of desperate fear he'd seen in Catherine's eyes when the doctor first said the word cancer. The fear of something terrible that you couldn't fight, couldn't escape, couldn't do anything about except hope that someone somewhere would help you. He'd been helpless then, helpless to save Catherine from the disease eating her alive from the inside, helpless to do anything except hold her hand and watch her slip away. But maybe he wasn't helpless now. Vincent slid over in the booth and patted the seat beside him. "Grandma," he said loud enough for the whole diner to hear his voice carrying that deep rumble that came from years of shouting over mining equipment. "Told you to wait by the bike. You're soaked through." The relief that flooded the old woman's face was immediate and profound. She didn't hesitate, didn't question it, just slipped into the booth beside him with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Her hand found his arm and gripped it, and Vincent could feel how badly she was shaking through the wet wool of her coat. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said softly, playing along. Without missing a beat, her voice taking on a grandmother's gentle warmth that sounded completely natural. "I got turned around in the rain." The diner door opened, the bell chimed cheerful and oblivious, and a man stepped inside. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and angular, in a way that suggested careful diet rather than manual labor, wearing a gray suit that was expensive enough that Vincent could identify the tailoring even from across the room. His hair was perfectly styled despite the rain, outside dark with distinguished gray at the temples, and he wore thin metal-framed glasses that gave him an intellectual professional appearance. Maybe 51, maybe 52 years old. But it wasn't his appearance that set off alarm bells in Vincent's head. It was the way he moved, the way he scanned the room slowly and methodically like a predator, cataloging prey-making calculations, assessing threats and opportunities. This was someone used to being in control, used to getting what he wanted, used to other people doing what he said. His eyes moved across the truck driver, who'd gone back to his eggs, across the two work guys who were trying to look like they weren't watching, across Beth, who stood behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand and a wary expression on her face. And then his eyes found Vincent and the elderly woman sitting together in the back booth. They stopped, locked on, and Vincent saw something flicker across the man's face. Not surprise exactly. More like a chess player who'd just seen an unexpected move on the board and was recalculating his strategy, running through new permutations, adapting his approach. The man's lips curved into a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with one hand, a casual gesture that somehow managed to look threatening, and started walking across the diner toward them. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine and clicked against the linoleum, with each step a measured rhythm that made Vincent think of a metronome. Nobody else in the diner made a sound. Even the rain seemed to quiet down, like the storm itself was holding its breath. He stopped beside the booth and looked down at them, that professional smile still in place, perfectly calibrated to project concern without warmth. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and controlled, the kind of voice that belonged to lawyers and executives and people who spent their lives in boardrooms negotiating other people's futures. "Good evening," he said, like he was greeting old friends at a cocktail party. "I apologize for the intrusion." His eyes moved to the elderly woman, and Vincent saw her press closer to his side. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been looking everywhere for you. Your family has been very worried." The woman, Mrs. Whitmore, apparently pressed closer to Vincent's side. Her grip on his arm tightened even more, and Vincent could feel her trembling through his sleeve. The man's smile didn't waver. "I'm Sterling Webb, Mrs. Whitmore's attorney. I was hired by her family to help bring her home safely. She's been missing for several days now, and everyone's been terribly concerned about her well-being." Vincent watched him carefully, watched his body language, his micro-expressions, the way he held himself with that perfect professional posture. Sterling Webb was calm, completely in control of himself, every word and gesture carefully chosen. Too much in control, actually. Real concern looked different than this. Real worry had rough edges, had urgency, had emotion bleeding through the cracks. This man was performing concern, not feeling it, delivering lines he'd rehearsed. "I don't have a family," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, her voice shaking but clear. "My daughter Sarah died 20 years ago, and I don't know you." Sterling's smile tightened just a fraction, just enough that Vincent noticed the slight compression at the corners of his mouth. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you're confused. That's exactly why we need to get you back to the care facility where the doctors can help you. You're not well. The disorientation, the memory gaps, these are symptoms we've discussed with your physicians." "I'm not confused," she said, and there was steel underneath the tremor in her voice, the kind of strength that came from years of holding yourself together when everything wanted to fall apart. "I know exactly who I am and what I'm doing." Sterling sighed like he was dealing with a difficult child who'd refused to take their medicine and reached into his inside jacket pocket. Vincent's body tensed involuntarily, old reflexes from a different life, kicking in, muscles coiling, ready for the possibility of a weapon. But Sterling only pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times with practiced efficiency, and held it up so Vincent could see. "Here," he said, turning the phone toward Vincent with the confidence of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. "Perhaps this will help clear things up." The photo on the screen showed Mrs. Whitmore standing next to Sterling Webb outside what looked like a large house, colonial style with white columns. She was smiling in the picture, wearing a clean dress and pearl necklace, her hair neatly styled, her posture relaxed. They looked like family in the photo, looked like a mother and son, or maybe a professional and client who had a warm relationship. On the surface, it looked perfectly normal, perfectly innocent. But Vincent had spent 45 years learning to read people, learning to tell the difference between what things look like and what they actually want them. Down in the mines, you learned to trust your instincts because your instincts were what kept you alive when the methane detector started clicking or the support beams started to groan. And right now, every instinct Vincent had was telling him that this photo, convincing as it looked, was wrong somehow. The smile didn't reach her eyes. Her shoulders were tense despite the casual pose. He looked at Mrs. Whitmore. "You know this man?" She shook her head so quickly it looked almost violent, her white hair still damp from the rain swinging with the motion. "No, I've never seen him before in my life. That picture, I don't know when it was taken or how, but I don't know him. I would never." Vincent looked back at Sterling Webb and let the silence stretch out for a moment. Watched him. Studied him the way he'd learned to study the coal seam, looking for cracks, for weaknesses, for the truth hidden underneath the surface. Sterling's polite smile was still in place, but Vincent could see the tension in his jaw now, the way his free hand had curled into a fist at his side, the tiny muscle twitching below his left eye. "Seems my grandma doesn't recognize you," Vincent said, slowly, keeping his voice level and calm, the same tone he'd used underground when things started to go wrong and panic would get people killed. The smile on Sterling's face tightened, even more professional veneers showing hairline cracks. Sir, I appreciate that you're trying to be helpful, but this is a private family matter. Mrs. Whitmore suffers from dementia and occasionally has episodes where she becomes disoriented and says things that aren't true. It's part of her condition. She may not remember me, but I assure you I have all the necessary legal documentation. Vincent didn't move, just kept his eyes locked on Sterling's face. She seems pretty clear to me. Knows her name, knows her daughter died, knows you're someone she doesn't want to go with. She's quite good at hiding it during her lucid periods, Sterling said, and there was an edge creeping into his voice now. The first hint of irritation breaking through the professional calm, like rust showing through chrome. But I assure you I have all the necessary legal documentation. I'm her court-appointed guardian, and I have a medical power of attorney signed by her physicians. That's a lie, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice stronger now, anger starting to burn through the fear, like sunlight through fog. All of it is lies. I've never been to a doctor who diagnosed me with anything. I've never been to a care facility. I've never signed anything giving anyone power of attorney. Beth, the waitress, had moved closer, coffee pot still in her hand, like maybe she was thinking about using it as a weapon if things went south, and she was watching the exchange with increasingly worried eyes. Maybe we should call the sheriff, she said, her voice carrying across the diner. Let them sort this out proper. Sterling turned his professional smile on her, but it looked more like a threat now than reassurance. That won't be necessary. I'd rather not involve the authorities in what amounts to a medical issue. Mrs. Whitmore just needs her medication and some rest, and this will all be resolved. I'm sure this gentleman understands he's being taken advantage of by a confused elderly woman. But Beth didn't look convinced. She looked at Mrs. Whitmore, really looked at her, then at Vincent, then back at Sterling. Her eyes narrowed like she was remembering something, puzzle pieces clicking together. I've seen you here before, she said slowly, her voice taking on a harder edge. About a week ago, maybe 10 days. You were here with her then too. Late at night, just like now. And she didn't want to go with you then either. Sterling's smile vanished completely, the mask dropping for just a second before he caught himself and tried to reconstruct it. I don't know what you're talking about. I do, Beth said, and her voice was firm now, her Midwestern backbone showing through. I remember because it bothered me something fierce. The way you had your hand on her arm real tight like you were forcing her. She was crying. I should have said something, then should have called someone. I've been kicking myself about it ever since. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees. Vincent felt Mrs. Whitmore's grip on his arm shift, her hand moving to clutch at his jacket, and when he glanced down at her, he saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over. They killed my husband, she whispered so quietly that only Vincent could hear her, the words meant just for him. Garrett, he found their records. He found everything they were doing. And they killed him 7 months ago and made it look like an accident. Vincent's attention snapped back to her face. She was looking up at him with those tear-filled eyes, and he saw the truth written there, as clear as a coal seam on a mine wall. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't dementia or disorientation or any medical condition. This was a woman who was genuinely terrified because she was genuinely in danger, who'd watched someone she loved die and knew she was next. Sterling must have seen Vincent's expression change, must have seen the shift from uncertain Good Samaritan to something harder and more dangerous because his whole demeanor shifted. The professional veneer dropped away completely, and something colder and harder took its place, like watching ice form over water. Sir, he said, and his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness, now had gone flat and threatening. You need to let Mrs. Whitmore come with me. This isn't your concern. You don't know what you're interfering with. Vincent slowly pushed himself to his feet, unfolding to his full height, rising like a mountain from the booth. The table creaked as he stood, and he saw Sterling take an involuntary half-step backward before catching himself and trying to hold his ground. Vincent stood 6'3" in his socks, with shoulders that had been built swinging a pickaxe for 2 decades and arms that could still lift an engine block without straining. Next to him, Sterling Webb looked thin and brittle, like a stick that would snap if you applied the right pressure in the right place. Seems to me, Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying that deep rumble that made people listen whether they wanted to or not, that it became my concern the minute my grandma asked for my help. Sterling's eyes narrowed behind his glasses, calculation running behind them like an abacus. You have no idea who you're dealing with, no idea what you're getting yourself into. You're probably right about that, Vincent agreed, his voice still calm, still level, like they were discussing the weather instead of standing on the edge of violence. But I know what I'm looking at right here, right now. And what I'm looking at is a scared woman who doesn't want to go anywhere with you, so she's not going. Outside, Vincent saw another set of headlights sweep into the parking lot through the rain-streaked windows. Another vehicle, another black sedan pulling up next to Sterling's Lincoln with predatory precision. His jaw tightened. This was escalating, fast-moving from confrontation to something more dangerous. Sterling saw where Vincent was looking, and his expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction, might have been triumph. "Last chance," he said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Step aside and this ends peacefully. Keep interfering and things get very complicated for you. We have resources, we have lawyers, we have ways of making problems disappear." Vincent didn't move, didn't blink. Things already are complicated. The diner door opened again with that cheerful chime, and two more men stepped inside, bringing cold air and the smell of rain with them. Both were large, both wore dark jackets over dark shirts, and both had the kind of blank professional expressions that Vincent recognized immediately from his years riding with the wolves. Enforcers, muscle. The kind of men who got hired to make problems go away, who asked no questions and felt no remorse, who did what they were paid to do and slept fine afterward. They positioned themselves near the entrance, blocking it with their bodies, and the atmosphere in the diner changed, immediately went from tense to dangerous. The truck driver stood up from his stool, clearly deciding he wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. But one of the enforcers held up a hand and shook his head slowly, a clear message. The truck driver froze his eyes wide. The two work guys in the booth looked like they wanted to run, but didn't dare move, barely breathing. Beth had gone pale, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand, but she didn't back down, didn't retreat to the kitchen. She stood her ground behind the counter, her jaw set. Sterling spread his hands slightly, a gesture that was meant to look reasonable but came across as threatening, like a snake spreading its hood. "You see how this is going to Gupendum," he said to Vincent, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, like he was explaining simple mathematics to a slow student. "I have resources. I have people. You're one man in the middle of nowhere with no backup and no way out. Your motorcycle is outside in the rain. You have no weapon that I can see. My associates here are professionals. Be smart about this." Mrs. Whitmore was pressed against Vincent's side now, and he could feel her entire body shaking, could feel her fear radiating through the wet wool of her coat. He looked down at her, at this tiny elderly woman who couldn't weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet, who'd walked into this diner out of desperation and asked a complete stranger for help because there was nobody else left to ask. Who'd chosen him for whatever reason out of everyone in this place because she'd seen Catherine's photograph and thought of her dead daughter and hoped that meant he might be someone who understood loss, who might help. And Vincent thought about Catherine in that hospital bed, thought about the helplessness he'd felt watching her die, thought about the promise she'd extracted from him with her last bit of strength. "Don't let my death shrink your world. Don't become someone small." Thought about how he'd been breaking that promise for 3 years, going through the motions without really living, letting the world happen around him without participating in it, watching from the sidelines while other people fought their battles. Maybe it was time to stop breaking that promise. Maybe it was time to stop being small. Vincent looked at Sterling Webb and the two enforcers and felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant for a long time, waking up and stretching old strength, returning to muscles that had forgotten what it felt like to stand for something. He wasn't afraid of these men. He'd faced worse in his life, faced cave-ins and explosions and moments where death was so close you could smell it coming off the rock walls. These were just bullies in expensive clothes, and Vincent had never had much patience for bullies. "Here's how it's actually going to go," Vincent said, his voice calm and level, each word deliberate. "You're going to turn around, walk back out that door, get in your expensive car, and drive away. Mrs. Whitmore stays with me. She stays until she says otherwise." Sterling laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a sharp bark of disbelief. "Or what, you'll fight us? There are 3 of us and 1 of you. We have legal documentation. We have—" Vincent was about to respond when he heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof, but growing louder with each passing second. A deep rumbling thunder that had nothing to do with the storm outside, that came from the highway instead of the sky. Motorcycles, multiple motorcycles, heavy touring bikes by the sound of them, those big V-twin engines that made the ground shake coming down the highway fast. Sterling heard it too. His expression flickered with uncertainty, for the first time the smooth professional mask showing cracks. The rumble grew louder, closer, building like an approaching avalanche, and then the parking lot outside exploded with noise and light as motorcycle after motorcycle roared in from the highway. Their engines echoing off the diner's walls like artillery, their headlights cutting through the rain in brilliant white beams that turned the parking lot into a stage. Chrome flashed under the flickering neon sign. Leather glistened with water. Patches caught the light. Vincent felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he watched them arrive, watched his brothers roll in like the cavalry, like fate, like the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. The Iron Wolves, his brothers. They'd been heading to Reno the same way he was taking the same route to honor Wrench, and by pure chance or fate or divine intervention or whatever you wanted to call it, they'd arrived at exactly the right moment. 15 bikes filled the parking lot in less than a minute, forming a loose semicircle around Sterling's cars like wolves surrounding prey, like a wall being built between Mrs. Whitmore and anyone who wanted to hurt her. The riders killed their engines one by one, and in the sudden relative quiet, Vincent could hear Sterling Webb's breathing quick and shallow, his professional composure finally cracking like ice under pressure. The diner door swung open and the first rider stepped inside, pulling off his helmet and shaking rain from his gray beard, water droplets flying. He was enormous, easily 300 pounds, most of it muscle that had gone a bit soft with age but was still impressive. Still spoke of strength that could bend steel if needed. Tattoos covered both massive arms in a tapestry of ink that told stories of decades on the road. And the Iron Wolves patch was stitched prominently across the back of his leather vest, worn and faded from years of wind and sun and rain. This was Clayton Merrick, road name Bulldog, and he'd been riding with the Wolves for 35 years longer than some of the younger members had been alive. Clayton's eyes swept the diner, taking in the scene with the kind of quick assessment that came from years of walking into uncertain situations and needing to understand them instantly. Vincent and Mrs. Whitmore in the booth, Sterling and his two enforcers positioned aggressively near the entrance, Beth behind the counter looking scared but defiant. The other customers frozen in place like rabbits who'd spotted a fox. His gaze landed on Vincent, and a grin split his weathered face, showing teeth that had seen a lot of bar fights and a lot of laughter. "Steele," he said, using Vincent's road name, the one he'd earned 5 years ago after taking a baseball bat to the ribs and not going down. "You called for backup, or did we just happen to arrive at the right time?" Vincent shrugged slightly, careful not to disturb Mrs. Whitmore, who was still gripping his jacket like a lifeline. "Little bit of both, maybe. Fate's got a sense of timing tonight." More riders filed in behind Clayton, filling the small diner with the smell of wet leather and motorcycle exhaust, and the particular energy that comes with 15 men who've ridden together through storms and celebrations and everything in between. Big men, hard men, men with scars and tattoos and years of road dust in their eyes and memories of battles fought and brothers lost. The Iron Wolves didn't look for trouble, never had, but they damn sure didn't run from it either, and they protected their own. Clayton's expression sobered as he looked at Mrs. Whitmore, his voice gentling in that way big men have when they're trying not to frighten someone smaller. "Ma'am," he said, tone respectful, almost tender. "You all right?" She nodded, still trembling, but looking stronger now, like the cavalry's arrival had given her back some piece of herself she'd lost. "I am now. Thank you." "Looks like family business to me," Clayton said, and there was steel underneath the gentle tone, a promise and a threat wrapped together. He turned his full attention to Sterling Webb, and Vincent watched the lawyer's face go a shade paler. "This gentleman bothering you. He's trying to make me go with him." Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice steadier now, with 15 bikers standing between her and the door, between her and whatever Sterling represented. "But I don't know him, and I don't want to go." Clayton nodded slowly, processing this, his jaw tightening. He looked at Sterling the way you'd look at something you found on the bottom of your boot. "Seems pretty clear-cut to me. Lady doesn't want to go with you, so she's not going." Sterling tried to recover his composure, tried to reassemble the professional mask like a man trying to put together a shattered mirror, but it was too late. He'd shown his hand, revealed the threat underneath the polish, and everyone in the room had seen him for what he really was. "This is none of your concern," Sterling said, but his voice had lost its authority, had gone thin and reedy. "This is a legal matter between—" "Don't really care," Clayton interrupted, his voice flat and final. "What I care about is, there's a scared old woman asking for help, and the code says you help when you can. We might not be pretty, we might not be respectable, but we keep our word. So she's under our protection now. You got a problem with that, you can take it up with all of us." Behind him, the other wolves nodded in agreement, a wall of solidarity. Several cracked their knuckles meaningfully, that particular sound that says things are about to get physical if they need to. One pulled out his phone and started filming, making sure there was a record of everything that happened next, evidence if things went to court protection against false accusations. Sterling looked at his two enforcers. They looked back at him and very slightly, almost imperceptibly, shook their heads. They'd signed up to intimidate one person, maybe two. Rough up a confused old woman, make her disappear, collect their paycheck. They hadn't signed up to fight 15 bikers in the middle of nowhere, with witnesses recording everything with Beth, the waitress ready to testify, with too many eyes and too many potential complications. The silence stretched out, broken only by the rain hammering on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder by the sound of water dripping from leather jackets onto linoleum. Vincent could see Sterling's mind working, calculating odds, considering options, trying to find a way to salvage this situation to regain control. But there wasn't one. He'd overplayed his hand and everyone knew it, and now he had to decide whether to fold or double down. Finally, Sterling's shoulders sagged slightly, just a fraction, but enough that Vincent knew the man had made his choice. He reached into his pocket, slowly making sure everyone could see his hand, and pulled out a business card. Set it on the table in front of Vincent with deliberate care like he was placing a chess piece. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, and there was promise in his voice, dark and certain, a threat disguised as a statement of fact. "Mrs. Whitmore has legal obligations, medical needs that won't just disappear. This won't simply go away because you surrounded her with motorcycles and good intentions." Vincent picked up the card and looked at it. Sterling Webb, attorney at law, with an address in Sacramento and a phone number. High-end law firm by the looks of it. He tucked it into his vest pocket without comment, without breaking eye contact. Sterling turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Mrs. Whitmore, his expression shifting into something that might have been pity, but looked more like contempt. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Eleanor. All we want is to help you, to make sure you're safe, to make sure you don't do something you'll regret." "No," she said, and her voice was clear and firm and carried across the entire diner like a bell. "All you want is to silence me, to make me disappear like you made Garrett disappear. But I won't be silenced. Garrett died trying to tell the truth, and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, even if it costs me everything I have left." Something flickered across Sterling's face, quick as lightning, anger maybe, or fear, or both, recognition that this old woman was more dangerous than he'd anticipated, that she wouldn't break as easily as they'd hoped. Then he turned and walked out, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum in a sharp staccato rhythm, his enforcers following behind him like shadows, like dogs called to heel. The diner was silent as they listened to the car start up outside, watched through the windows as the Lincoln and the sedan pulled out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel, their taillights disappearing into the rain and darkness like predators retreating to wait for another opportunity. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Clayton let out a breath and turned to Vincent, the tension draining from his shoulders. "So," he said, and there was wry humor in his voice now, "you want to tell us what the hell that was about?" Vincent looked down at Mrs. Whitmore. She was still shaking, but the fear in her eyes had been replaced by something else. Relief, maybe. Or hope. Or just exhaustion, now that the immediate danger had passed, now that she could finally let her guard down even for a moment. "I think," Vincent said slowly, "we all need to sit down and have a conversation." Mrs. Whitmore nodded and finally loosened her death grip on his jacket. She looked up at him with eyes that were wet with tears, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that had been bottled up for months. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to help me. You don't even know me, but thank you. Thank you for not turning away." Vincent thought about Catherine, about promises made and promises kept, about second chances and the possibility of redemption, about how sometimes the universe put people in your path at exactly the moment when you needed them most, or maybe when they needed you, and it was up to you to recognize those moments and act. "You're welcome," he said quietly. Then with a slight smile, "Besides, can't have folks thinking bikers don't look after their own." Beth came over with fresh coffee and extra mugs, her hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline, but determination burning in her eyes. "I'll make a fresh pot," she said, her voice stronger now, "and get some food going. Looks like you all are going to be here for a while. And Mrs. Whitmore, honey, you look like you could use something warm in your belly." The other wolves settled into booths and at the counter, their presence filling the small diner with a strange sense of security, like a fortress had been built around this one frightened woman. Outside, the storm continued to rage, lightning flashing and thunder rolling across the desert. But outside the Starlight Diner, surrounded by strangers who'd become allies in the span of minutes, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore finally felt safe enough to tell her story. And Vincent Callahan, for the first time in 3 years, felt like maybe he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Maybe this was what Catherine had meant. Not just staying alive, but actually living. Not just going through the motions, but standing up when someone needed you to stand. Not letting grief make you small, but letting purpose make you larger than your pain. He settled back into the booth, poured fresh coffee, and prepared to listen. The coffee had gone cold in Vincent's mug by the time Eleanor Whitmore finished telling her story, but he hadn't noticed. None of them had. The entire diner sat in silence, 15 battle-hardened bikers listening to a 73-year-old woman speak in a voice that occasionally trembled, but never broke, never wavered from the truth she was determined to tell. Her husband Garrett had been an accountant. Not the exciting kind you saw in movies, not the type who worked for celebrities or managed hedge funds, just a regular accountant for a mid-sized development company called Apex Ridge, handling their books and ledgers and tax filings for 12 years. Honest work for honest pay. The kind of job that let him and Eleanor live a quiet life in a small house with a garden she tended and a porch where they'd sit together in the evenings watching the sun go down. Garrett had been meticulous. It was what made him good at his job. He noticed when numbers didn't add up, when expenses appeared in the wrong columns, when money seemed to move in ways that didn't quite make sense. And about 8 months ago, he'd started noticing patterns that bothered him. Property developments that existed on paper but not in reality. Shell companies receiving payments for services never rendered. Investor money flowing into projects that were supposed to be building senior housing communities, affordable places where elderly people could live out their retirement with dignity and security. But the communities never materialized. The land sat empty. The buildings were never constructed. And the money, millions of dollars in total, simply disappeared into a maze of offshore accounts and corporate structures so complex that tracing it required months of careful work. Garrett had done that work. Spent his evenings and weekends following the money trail, documenting everything in his careful handwriting, because he didn't trust digital files that could be erased or hacked. He'd filled a ledger with dates and amounts and account numbers, with the names of shell corporations and the routing information for banks in the Cayman Islands. $6.4 million stolen from elderly investors who trusted Apex Ridge to build them a place to live, to give them security in their final years. When Garrett had enough evidence, when he was certain of what he'd found, he'd gone to his supervisor. Then to the company's chief financial officer. Then to the CEO himself, a man named Conrad Breckenridge, who'd built Apex Ridge from nothing 30 years ago and had the reputation of being a pillar of the business community. Conrad had listened to Garrett's presentation with a pleasant smile on his face, had thanked him for his diligence, had promised a full internal investigation, had shaken Garrett's hand and told him he was exactly the kind of employee Apex Ridge valued. 3 days later, Garrett's car had gone off the road on his way home from work. The investigators said the brakes had failed, catastrophic failure of the hydraulic system, tragic accident, but these things happen with older vehicles. Garrett had died instantly when the car hit the ravine wall. He was 71 years old. Eleanor had known immediately that it wasn't an accident. Garrett had just had the car serviced 2 weeks before. The mechanic had told him the brakes were fine, would be good for another year at least. But when Eleanor tried to tell the police her suspicions, they looked at her with sympathetic eyes and gentle voices and explained that grief sometimes made people see conspiracies where there were only tragedies. She'd buried her husband alone, their only child having died 20 years earlier, in a car accident of her own, no grandchildren to carry on the family name or share her sorrow. And then she'd gone home to an empty house and found the ledger Garrett had hidden in a loose floorboard in the closet, along with a note that said, "If anything happens to me, take this to the FBI. Don't trust anyone from Apex. Eleanor, I love you. Tell the truth." That had been 7 months ago. For the first few months, Eleanor had tried to do what Garrett asked. She'd contacted the FBI field office in Sacramento, left messages, sent letters. But nothing happened. No one called her back. No one seemed interested in the accusations of a grieving widow against a respected company. Then Sterling Webb had shown up at her door. He'd been polite at first, professional, introduced himself as Apex Ridge's attorney, expressed condolences for her loss, explained that the company wanted to make sure she was taken care of. They were prepared to offer a generous settlement, a lump sum payment to cover any financial hardship and ensure her comfort for the rest of her life. All she had to do was sign some papers acknowledging that Garrett's death was accidental and agreeing not to pursue any further claims against the company. Eleanor had refused. Sterling's visits had become more frequent after that, more insistent. The offers turned into pressure, the pressure into threats. He'd started bringing papers that claimed she was mentally incompetent, that she needed a legal guardian to manage her affairs. He'd shown up with doctors she'd never met who tried to examine her to declare her unfit. And when she still refused, when she barricaded herself in her house and called the local police, they'd come and listen politely, but done nothing because Sterling had court documents that looked official and Eleanor had only her word. She'd run 3 days ago, packed what she could carry, took Garrett's ledger and what little cash she had, and fled in the middle of the night. She'd been staying in cheap motels paying cash, trying to figure out how to get to the FBI office in person where they couldn't ignore her. But Sterling had people looking for her. She'd seen them in town, men in suits asking questions, showing her photograph. Tonight she'd been driving through the storm exhausted and scared and running out of money when she'd seen the Starlight Diner and pulled in hoping for coffee and a few minutes of warmth. And then Sterling had found her, and she'd looked around the diner in desperation and seen Vincent sitting alone in that back booth. She'd seen the leather vest with its patches, seen the size of him, the scars on his knuckles, the gray in his beard, seen someone who looked dangerous, who looked like the kind of man who wouldn't be easily intimidated. And in that moment of pure desperation, she'd made a choice to trust a complete stranger because there was no one else left to trust. When Eleanor finished speaking, the silence in the diner was absolute. Even the rain outside seemed to have quieted, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Clayton was the first to speak. He pulled off his reading glasses, the ones he wore for detailed work, and set them on the table. His expression was carved from stone. "Let me see the ledger," he said quietly. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before reaching into her purse and pulling out a small notebook bound in cracked leather. She handed it to Clayton with trembling fingers, and he opened it carefully, turning pages filled with Garrett's neat handwriting. Numbers and dates and names, all documented with the precision of a man who'd spent his life making sure the numbers added up. Clayton read for several minutes, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up and met Vincent's eyes across the table. "This is real," he said. "This is federal fraud. Wire fraud, securities, fraud, elder abuse. If this is accurate, and I've got no reason to think it isn't, we're looking at dozens of felonies. Prison time measured in decades, not years." "Which is why they killed Garrett," said a voice from the counter. Everyone turned to look at Beth, the waitress who was gripping the edge of the counter with white knuckles. "And why they're trying to make Eleanor disappear." Beth's story came out in fits and starts, her voice shaking with emotion she'd kept buried for 3 years. Her husband Jared had worked construction for Apex Ridge. He'd been a carpenter, skilled with his hands, proud of his work. 3 years ago, he'd been part of a crew building a mixed-use development, downtown residential units, on top of commercial space below. Good project, good pay, supposed to revitalize a struggling neighborhood. But the one had problems from the start. Materials that didn't meet code specifications. Safety equipment that was outdated or missing entirely. Supervisors who pushed the crew to work faster, cut corners, ignore regulations. Jared had complained, had written everything down in a work journal. He kept documentation of every violation he saw. The scaffolding failure had happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Jared and 2 other men had been working on the 4th floor when the platform gave way. Investigators determined that the scaffolding had been improperly installed and the load calculations were wrong. Tragic accident. Apex Ridge had settled with the families quietly generous cash payments in exchange for non-disclosure agreements and no further legal action. Beth had signed because she had 2 kids to feed and a mortgage she couldn't pay on her own. Had taken the money and the NDA and tried to move on with her life. Tried not to think about the fact that her husband had died because someone at Apex cared more about saving money than about worker safety. But she'd kept Jared's journal, hidden it in a box in her attic, along with his work boots and hard hat and the photographs of him she couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bear to throw away either. "I'll get it," she said, now her voice firmer. "It's at my house 20 minutes from here. If it helps prove what they did, if it helps make sure they can't do this to anyone else, then to hell with the NDA. They can sue me if they want." Vincent felt something stirring in his chest, something that had been dormant for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Purpose. Direction. The sense that he was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered. These people, Eleanor and Beth, and all the victims who'd been hurt by Apex Ridge's greed, they deserved justice. They deserved someone to stand up and fight for them. And maybe, just maybe, this was why Catherine had made him promise to keep living. Not just to go through the motions, but to actually live, to do something that meant something, to be the kind of man who helped people who needed help. "All right," Vincent said, and every eye in the diner turned to him. "Here's what we're going to do. We're taking Eleanor to the FBI office in Sacramento first thing tomorrow morning, in person, where they can't ignore her. Beth, you get that journal and bring it to us. Between Eleanor's ledger and Jared's documentation, we'll have enough evidence that they'll have to open an investigation. Sacramento's 200 miles west, Clayton said. That's at least 4 hours on the bikes in good weather. In this rain, could be 5 or 6. Then we leave at dawn, Vincent said. Give the storm time to pass. We'll ride escort, make sure Eleanor gets there safe. One of the other wolves, a lean man in his 50s with graying red hair and a scar across his cheek, leaned forward. His road name was Chain, and he'd been a long-haul trucker before he started riding. Apex is going to know we're coming. That Sterling character didn't strike me as the type to just give up and go home. Let them know, Vincent said. Let them try to stop us. We'll be ready. Clayton nodded slowly, a grim smile tugging at his mouth. Been a while since we had a proper road run with purpose behind it. I'm in. Rest of you. One by one, the wolves voiced their agreement. These were men who'd spent their lives on the margins of society, who'd chosen the freedom of the road over the security of conventional life. But they lived by a code unwritten but absolute. You stood by your brothers. You protected those who couldn't protect themselves. And you didn't let bullies win just because they wore suits instead of colors. Eleanor was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope that had seemed impossible just an hour ago. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. All of you. You don't know me. You have no reason to help me, but you're risking yourselves anyway. Vincent reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Grandmas need looking after, he said again. Besides, seems to me you're doing the right thing here. That's reason enough. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time they made plans for the night. The wolves would camp in the parking lot, their bikes forming a protective circle around Eleanor, who would sleep in one of the diner's back storage rooms that Beth converted into a makeshift bedroom. Vincent would take first watch sitting by the front window where he could see anyone approaching. Beth made sandwiches and fresh coffee, refusing payment, saying it was the least she could do. The wolves ate and talked in low voices, the conversation drifting from the current situation to old stories, shared memories of rides and runs, and brothers who'd passed on. Eleanor sat among them and listened, and slowly her trembling stopped, her breathing evened out, and something like peace settled over her exhausted features. Around midnight, most of the wolves settled down to sleep using their saddlebags as pillows and their leather vests as blankets. Clayton stayed up with Vincent, the two of them sitting in the booth by the window, watching the darkness outside. You did a good thing tonight, Clayton said quietly. Catherine would be proud. Vincent glanced at him surprised. They didn't usually talk about Catherine. The wolves had loved her, had mourned her death almost as much as Vincent had, but there was an unspoken agreement not to bring her up because they all knew how much it hurt him. I keep thinking about something she said, Vincent replied after a moment. Right before the end, she told me not to let her death make me small, said I had a big heart and a strong back, and the world needed men like that, needed people who'd stand up when it mattered. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, thought she was just talking because the morphine made her philosophical. And now I think maybe she knew I'd spend years hiding from the world, going through the motions but not really living. Maybe she was trying to give me permission to care again, to let things matter. Clayton nodded slowly. Well, this matters. That woman in there, she's got nobody else. And those people who got scammed, they deserve justice. So yeah, this matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the occasional car pass by on the wet highway headlights, cutting through the darkness and then vanishing. Vincent's mind was already turning over the logistics of tomorrow's ride. Best route to Sacramento. Places to stop if they needed to. What to do if Apex tried to intercept them on the road. His phone buzzed in his pocket, surprising him. Not many people had his number anymore, and fewer still would call at midnight. He pulled it out and looked at the screen, and his breath caught when he saw the name. Silas Callahan, his brother, calling him for the first time in 6 years. Vincent stared at the phone for 3 rings before answering. Yeah, Vincent. Silas's voice sounded older than Vincent remembered, rougher around the edges. I saw the news. There's a silver alert out for an elderly woman, Eleanor Whitmore, missing from her home in Auburn, considered vulnerable. And I just heard from a friend on the police force that she was last seen at a diner on Highway 50 with a biker matching your description. Vincent closed his eyes. Of course, Sterling would have filed a missing person report. Of course, he'd use every legal tool at his disposal to make this look like a concerned family trying to find a confused elderly woman instead of what it really was. She's safe, Vincent said. She's with me. Vincent, what the hell are you doing interfering with a vulnerable person that's serious? You could go to jail. She's not vulnerable, Silas. She's being hunted. There's a difference. Vincent laid it out as briefly as he could. The fraud, Garrett's death, Sterling's threats, the evidence Eleanor had, the fact that Apex Ridge was trying to silence her before she could expose them. Silas was quiet for a long time after Vincent finished. Then he sighed, and it sounded like the weight of the world was in that breath. Vincent, if what you're saying is true, this is bigger than you can handle on your own. This is federal crime. This needs federal authorities. That's where we're headed, FBI office in Sacramento, soon as the sun comes up. Let me help, Silas said, and there was something in his voice that Vincent hadn't heard in years. Not judgment, not disapproval, just concern. I'm in Auburn. That's halfway between where you are and Sacramento. Bring her to my church, Calvary Baptist, just off Highway 80. I can hide her somewhere safe, and I know people who can help, people who won't be intimidated by corporate lawyers. Vincent hesitated. Accepting help from Silas meant reopening a door that had been closed for 6 years. Meant confronting all the things they'd said to each other, all the ways they'd hurt each other, when grief made them both say things they didn't mean. But it also meant giving Eleanor the best possible chance of staying safe. And right now, that mattered more than Vincent's pride or his pain. All right, Vincent said, we'll be there tomorrow afternoon. But Silas, you need to understand what you're getting into. These people killed to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to come after anyone who gets in their way. I understand, Silas said calmly. I'm a preacher, Vincent. I've spent my whole adult life telling people to do what's right even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. Be pretty hypocritical if I didn't follow my own advice when it mattered. Despite everything, Vincent felt a small smile tugging at his mouth. Yeah, it would be. Vincent, Silas said, and his voice softened. I'm glad you called. I'm glad you're doing this, and I'm sorry for everything I said after Catherine died. I was wrong. We both said things we shouldn't have, Vincent replied. We'll talk when I get there. Really talk. I'd like that. They said goodbye, and Vincent ended the call, tucking the phone back in his pocket. Clayton had been listening quietly, and now he raised an eyebrow. Your brother's a preacher. Yeah, we don't really talk about it. Huh, world's full of surprises, isn't it? Vincent huffed a quiet laugh. You have no idea. The rest of the night passed slowly. Vincent took his watch, then traded off with Chain, then took another watch as dawn started to lighten the eastern sky. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a clean-washed world that smelled of rain and sage. The highway was empty and quiet, and for a while Vincent let himself just sit and watch the sun come up, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. Eleanor emerged from the storage room around 6:30, looking better than she had the night before. Beth had found her some clean clothes that almost fit, and she'd washed her face and combed her hair. And though she still looked exhausted, there was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before. How'd you sleep? Vincent asked as she slid into the booth across from him. Better than I have in months, she said. First time in a long time, I wasn't afraid someone would break down my door in the middle of the night. Your friends, they're good men. They are, Vincent agreed. Different than most people expect when they see the leather and the tattoos, but good men all the same. Eleanor studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes seeing more than Vincent was comfortable with. You lost someone, she said. It wasn't a question. My wife, Catherine, 3 years ago. I'm sorry, cancer. Vincent nodded. Took her fast, 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Garrett and I had 51 years together, Eleanor said softly. Every morning I still wake up and forget for a second that he's gone. Reach for him in bed before I remember. You ever do that? Every day, Vincent admitted. Wake up and think I smell her coffee or hear her moving around the house. Then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed his hand, the same gesture he'd given her the night before. It doesn't stop hurting, she said, but it changes, becomes less sharp, more like an ache you carry with you. And eventually you learn to carry it without it breaking you. Catherine made me promise not to give up, Vincent said. Not to let her death make me stop living. But I haven't been very good at keeping that promise. You're keeping it now, Eleanor said firmly. You're here, you're helping. You're fighting for something that matters. That's living, Vincent. That's exactly what she would have wanted. Beth brought them breakfast pancakes and bacon and eggs cooked exactly right. The other wolves woke and ate, and gradually the diner filled with the energy of men preparing for a journey. They checked their bikes, secured their gear, made sure everything was ready for the long ride ahead. Vincent called Silas back and confirmed they'd be arriving around 2 in the afternoon. Silas gave him the exact address of the church and promised to have everything ready. Said he'd already made some calls, reached out to people he trusted, started building a network of support for when Eleanor was ready to tell her story publicly. They left the Starlight Diner just after 8 when the sun was fully up and the road was dry. Eleanor rode in the sidecar Vincent had rigged to his bike years ago for long hauls, wrapped in a warm jacket one of the wolves had donated, and wearing a helmet that was too big for her but would keep her safe. She looked tiny in the sidecar, fragile and vulnerable, but her eyes were bright and determined. 15 motorcycles pulled out onto Highway 50 in tight formation, Clayton in the lead, and Vincent bringing up the rear with Eleanor beside him. The sound of their engines was like thunder rolling across the desert, a declaration that they were coming and they wouldn't be stopped. They rode west into the morning sun through landscape that shifted from desert to foothills as they climbed toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. The air grew cooler, scented with pine instead of sage, and the road twisted and turned through passes and valleys carved by ancient glaciers. Around noon, they stopped at a gas station in a small town called Placerville. While the bikes refueled, Vincent checked in with Eleanor, making sure she was holding up okay. She was stiff and sore from the ride, but insisted she was fine, that the discomfort was nothing compared to the relief of being surrounded by protection. Beth arrived while they were stopped, driving a beat-up Honda sedan and carrying a cardboard box. She found Vincent in the gas station parking lot and handed him the box with hands that shook slightly. "Jared's journal," she said. 3 years of documentation. Every safety violation, every corner cut, every time a supervisor told them to ignore regulations. It's all in there. Vincent took the box carefully, feeling the weight of it. "This is brave," he said. "Breaking the NDA, going public with this. You could lose everything." Beth's jaw tightened. "I already lost everything that mattered when Jared died. This is about making sure it meant something. Making sure he didn't die for nothing." "It won't be for nothing," Vincent promised. "We'll make sure of that." They reached Auburn just after 2 in the afternoon, rolling into the small town under clear blue skies. Calvary Baptist Church sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees, a modest white building with a simple steeple and a parking lot that was empty except for one car. Silas was waiting outside, and Vincent's breath caught when he saw his brother for the first time in 6 years. Silas looked older. His dark hair had gone mostly gray, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he stood straight and strong, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, and when the bikes pulled in, he walked forward with no hesitation, no fear of the 15 leather-clad bikers rolling into his church parking lot. His eyes found Vincent and held. For a moment, neither brother moved. Then Silas smiled, just a small quirk of his mouth, and opened his arms. Vincent killed his engine, climbed off the bike, and crossed the distance between them. The hug was awkward at first, too many years of silence and hurt between them, but then Silas gripped him tight, and Vincent gripped him back, and something that had been broken for a very long time started just maybe to heal. "Good to see you, brother," Silas said quietly. "You too," Vincent replied, and meant it. They pulled apart, and Silas turned his attention to Eleanor, who was climbing carefully out of the sidecar with Clayton's assistance. He approached her with a gentle smile and extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Silas Callahan. Welcome to Calvary Baptist. You're safe here." Eleanor took his hand and searched his face, seeing something there that made her relax. "Thank you, Reverend, for taking this risk." "It's not a risk to do what's right," Silas said simply. "Come inside. I've got some people who want to meet you." Inside the church, a group of elderly people were waiting. Maybe 30 of them, ranging from their 60s to their 80s, sitting in the pews and talking in quiet voices. They fell silent when Eleanor walked in, every eye turning toward her. Silas addressed the room. "Everyone, this is Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor, these are members of my congregation, and they all have something in common with you." An elderly man in the front row stood up, leaning heavily on a cane. He had to be close to 80, with deeply lined skin and hands that trembled with age, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "My name is Walter Grimshaw," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet church. 5 years ago, my wife Dottie and I invested our retirement savings with Apex Ridge Development. They promised us a spot in a senior living community, affordable and safe, where we could spend our final years. We gave them $180,000. Everything we had." He paused, swallowing hard. "The community was never built. The land sat empty. When we tried to get our money back, they told us it had been spent on development costs, that we'd signed contracts absolving them of liability if the project failed. We lost everything. Had to sell our house, move in with our daughter. Dottie died last year, still thinking it was our fault for being foolish enough to trust them." Walter looked at Eleanor with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "We weren't foolish. We were victims. And I've carried that shame for 5 years, thinking we were the only ones stupid enough to fall for it. But we weren't the only ones, were we? Eleanor shook her head slowly. No, you weren't. Garrett found evidence of at least 8 different developments over 12 years. Over 300 victims total. A murmur ran through the congregation. More people stood one by one and told their stories. A woman named Alice, who'd lost $100,000. A couple named the Hendersons, who'd invested their life savings. A man named Frank, whose mother had died in poverty after Apex Ridge took everything she had. Story after story after story, each one a variation on the same theme. Trust betrayed, savings stolen, lives ruined. And Apex Ridge had gotten away with it because their victims were elderly, isolated, ashamed of being fooled, too scared or too tired to fight back. But now they had evidence. Now they had Eleanor's ledger and Jared's journal and a room full of people willing to testify. Now they had the Iron Wolves providing protection and a preacher willing to risk his reputation to do what was right. Now they had a chance. Vincent stood at the back of the church and watched Eleanor move among the other victims, holding their hands, sharing their grief, offering comfort, born of her own pain. And he thought about Catherine again, about her insistence that he keep living, keep fighting, keep being someone who stood up when it mattered. This mattered. These people mattered. And for the first time in 3 years, Vincent felt like maybe he was becoming the man Catherine had believed he could be. Clayton appeared beside him, arms crossed over his broad chest. Hell of a thing, he said quietly. All these people, all this pain, and one company just kept doing it because they could. Not anymore, Vincent said. We're going to stop them. FBI office in Sacramento first thing tomorrow. First thing, Vincent confirmed. And we're not leaving until they agree to open an investigation. I don't care how long it takes, Clayton nodded. Wouldn't expect anything less. As the sun set outside the church windows, painting the stained glass in shades of amber and gold, the victims of Apex Ridge's greed began to organize. They shared documents and contact information. They made lists of everyone they knew who'd been affected. They talked about media contacts and lawyers in ways to make sure their story couldn't be ignored or suppressed. And in the middle of it all, Eleanor Whitmore stood tall, no longer a frightened woman running for her life, but a warrior fighting for justice. Fighting for Garrett. Fighting for Walter and Alice and Frank and all the others whose trust had been betrayed. Vincent caught Silas watching him from across the room. His brother smiled and nodded a gesture of approval and respect, and Vincent nodded back. Tomorrow they would take this fight to the FBI. Tomorrow they would demand justice for every elderly person Apex Ridge had victimized. Tomorrow they would make sure that Garrett Whitmore hadn't died for nothing. But tonight in this small church in Auburn, surrounded by broken people, finding strength and shared purpose, Vincent Callahan finally understood what Catherine had meant when she told him not to let her death make him small. Sometimes the biggest thing you could do was stand beside someone who needed you and refuse to let them fall. And that, Vincent thought, was exactly what he intended to do. Dawn came cold and clear to Auburn, the kind of California morning where the air smelled like pine and possibility, and the world felt scrubbed clean by the night. Vincent stood in the parking lot of Calvary Baptist Church, drinking coffee from a paper cup and watching his breath fig in the early light while the other wolves prepared their bikes for the final leg of the journey to Sacramento. Eleanor had slept in Silas's small office, converted temporarily into a bedroom, with a cot and clean sheets and a door that locked from the inside. She emerged just after 6, looking rested, despite everything, her white hair neatly combed and her shoulders squared like a woman preparing for battle, which Vincent supposed she was. Silas had spent the previous evening making calls, reaching out through his network of clergy and community organizers, and people who cared about justice more than they cared about staying comfortable. By the time the sun set, he connected with a journalist named Iris Brennan, who specialized in financial crimes and had won a Pulitzer for exposing a Medicare fraud scheme 5 years earlier. She was driving down from San Francisco this morning, would meet them at the FBI office, ready to document everything. The plan was simple on the surface. Ride to Sacramento, walk into the FBI field office on J Street, demand to speak with whoever handled white-collar crime, and present Eleanor's evidence, along with testimony from the other victims. Make enough noise that they couldn't ignore, it couldn't sweep it under the rug, couldn't pretend this was just a confused elderly woman making baseless accusations. But Vincent knew better than to think it would actually be simple. Sterling Webb and Apex Ridge had too much at stake to just let this happen. They'd fight back, and they'd fight dirty, and Vincent needed to be ready for whatever they tried. Clayton walked over his boots, crunching on gravel, and stood beside Vincent in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. Got a bad feeling about today, he said quietly. The kind that usually means trouble's coming. Vincent nodded. Yeah, me too. Talked to some of the boys last night. We're all in whatever happens. Eleanor gets to that FBI office and tells her story no matter what it takes. Appreciate it, Bulldog. Means a lot. Clayton clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood and solidarity. That's what family does. And that woman in there, she's family now, whether she knows it or not. Wolves protect their own. They loaded up just after 7, Eleanor once again in Vincent's sidecar wrapped against the cold in layers of borrowed jackets. The congregation members who'd gathered the night before came out to see them off, lining the parking lot with their walkers and canes and weathered faces full of hope that Vincent desperately wanted to fulfill. Walter Grimshaw approached the bikes, moving slowly but with purpose, and pressed a worn Bible into Eleanor's hands. Dottie's, he said, his voice rough with emotion. She carried it every day of her life. Would have wanted you to have it now for strength. Eleanor clutched the Bible to her chest, tears streaming down her face. I'll make this right, Walter. I promise. For Dottie. For all of them. I know you will, dear. I know you will. The ride to Sacramento took just under 2 hours, 15 motorcycles moving in tight formation through the foothills and down into the valley where California's capital city sprawled beneath a blanket of morning haze. They took Highway 80 west, and Vincent kept his eyes scanning constantly, watching for any sign of trouble, any indication that Apex had set up an ambush or a roadblock. But the highway remained clear. Traffic was light, mostly commuters heading into the city for work, and none of them paid much attention to the biker convoy beyond the occasional nervous glance or wide berth. They rolled through the suburbs and into downtown Sacramento without incident, and Vincent allowed himself a small measure of hope that maybe, just maybe, this would go smoothly. The FBI field office occupied a nondescript government building on J Street, all concrete and tinted glass, and American flags hanging limp in the still morning air. The wolves parked their bikes in the public lot across the street, a wall of chrome and leather that drew stares from the few pedestrians out this early. Iris Brennan was already waiting, leaning against a silver Prius and tapping something into her phone. She was in her early 50s, Vincent guessed, with sharp features and gray-streaked black hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a blazer and had the look of someone who'd spent years digging through documents and asking uncomfortable questions. She straightened when she saw Eleanor, something lighting up in her expression that Vincent recognized, the look of a journalist who'd just found a story worth telling. Mrs. Whitmore, Iris said, extending her hand. Iris Brennan, Reverend Callahan filled me in on the basics last night. I've been doing some preliminary research on Apex Ridge, and what you're describing fits a pattern I've been tracking for years. Elder financial abuse is epidemic in this country, and companies like Apex get away with it because their victims are too ashamed or too scared to come forward. Eleanor shook her hand firmly. I'm not ashamed, and I'm not scared anymore. I just want justice for my husband and everyone else they hurt. Then let's go get it, Iris said with a grim smile. They walked across the street together, all of them 15 bikers and one elderly woman and one journalist and one purpose that bound them tighter than blood. The security guard at the entrance took one look at the group and immediately called for backup, speaking urgently into his radio about a potential situation. Vincent held up his hands, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. We're here to report a crime. Federal crime. We need to speak with whoever handles white-collar fraud. The guard looked skeptical, his hand resting on his sidearm, but before he could respond, a door opened behind him, and a woman in her 50s stepped out. She wore a dark pantsuit and had her credentials clipped to her belt, and she looked at the assembled group with sharp, assessing eyes. I'm Special Agent Laura Garrison, she said, her voice carrying authority, but not hostility. I heard something about fraud. Eleanor stepped forward, Dottie's Bible still clutched in one hand and Garrett's ledger in the other. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. My husband was murdered 7 months ago because he discovered that Apex Ridge Development has been systematically defrauding elderly investors. I have evidence, I have witnesses, and I need someone to listen. Agent Garrison studied Eleanor for a long moment, and Vincent saw her take in the exhaustion in Eleanor's face, the determination in her posture, the genuine fear still lurking in her eyes. Saw her look at the ledger, at the Bible, at the group of bikers standing protectively around this tiny woman. All right, she said finally, let's talk. But I can't have 15 motorcycles in my lobby. You, she pointed at Vincent and Clayton, can come with Mrs. Whitmore. The rest of you wait outside. Vincent looked at Eleanor. That okay with you, Grandma? She nodded. That's fine. I trust these two. They followed Agent Garrison into the building through security checkpoints and down institutional hallways that all looked the same until they reached a conference room with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. Garrison gestured for them to sit, then took a seat across from them and pulled out a legal pad. "Start from the beginning," she said, "and don't leave anything out." Eleanor told her story again, and this time Vincent heard details she hadn't shared before. How Garrett had come home shaking after his meeting with Conrad Breckenridge, how he'd held her that night and whispered that he was afraid but couldn't stay silent. How she'd found the ledger only because she'd remembered him saying once that if anything happened to him, she should check the closet floor. She told Garrison about Sterling Webb's visits, about the fake medical documents, about running for her life and hiding in cheap motels, and finally walking into that diner and asking a stranger for help because there was nobody else left to ask. Agent Garrison listened without interrupting, taking notes in quick shorthand, and when Eleanor finished, she sat back and tapped her pen against the legal pad. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Whitmore. This is serious. If what you're alleging is true, we're looking at wire fraud securities, fraud elder abuse, possibly even wrongful death. But allegations aren't evidence. I need to see what you have." Eleanor pushed Garrett's ledger across the table. Garrison opened it carefully and began reading, her expression growing darker with each page. She pulled out her phone and took photographs of several pages, then looked up at Eleanor. "Where did your husband get this information?" "He was Apex Ridge's accountant, senior accountant. He had access to all their financial records." "And you say he died in a car accident 7 months ago?" "They said it was an accident, but Garrett just had the car serviced. The brakes were fine. And then 3 days after he confronts the CEO about fraud, suddenly the brakes fail." Garrison made a note. "I'll need to see the accident report, the autopsy, any documentation you have." "I have copies," Eleanor said, "at home, or what used to be my home before I had to run." "We also have corroborating evidence," Vincent said, and explained about Jared Harper and the construction deaths and Beth's willingness to break her NDA. Explained about the congregation members in Auburn, all victims of Apex Ridge's schemes. Garrison's pen moved rapidly across the page. "How many victims are we talking about?" "At least 300 over 12 years, Eleanor said. "Maybe more. Garrett didn't have time to finish his investigation before they killed him." "Mrs. Whitmore," Garrison said gently, "I understand why you believe your husband was murdered, but I need you to understand that proving it will be extremely difficult. Car accidents happen. Brake failures, while unusual, aren't impossible. Without evidence of tampering." "Then find the evidence," Eleanor interrupted, and there was steel in her voice that made Garrison blink. "Get a warrant. Examine the car. Interview the mechanic who serviced it 2 weeks before. Do your job and find the truth." Garrison studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm sorry. You deserve a real investigation, not dismissive platitudes." She stood up. "Wait here. I need to bring my supervisor in on this. If we're going to move forward, I'll need authorization." She left the room, and Vincent heard the lock click behind her. He looked at Eleanor and saw her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline of the confrontation wore off. "You did good," he said quietly. "She's taking you seriously." "I hope so," Eleanor whispered, "because if she doesn't, I don't know what else to do." They waited 20 minutes that felt like hours. Vincent paced the small conference room, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, that they were too exposed, too vulnerable, sitting in this building, while Sterling Webb and Apex Ridge knew exactly where they were. When the door finally opened again, Agent Garrison returned with a man in his 60s who introduced himself as Assistant Special Agent in Charge Marcus Holt. He had gray hair cut military short and the bearing of someone who'd spent a career in law enforcement, and he looked at the three of them with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, taking the seat across from her, "I've reviewed your allegations and the preliminary evidence Agent Garrison photographed. I want you to know that we take elder fraud very seriously, and if Apex Ridge is doing what you claim, we will investigate fully and prosecute to the fullest extent of the law." Eleanor sagged with relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "However," Holt continued, and Vincent's jaw tightened at that word, "I need to be clear about what happens next. An investigation of this scope will take months, possibly years. We'll need to subpoena records, interview witnesses, build an airtight case. In the meantime, Apex Ridge will continue operating, and they'll fight us every step of the way with expensive lawyers and political connections." "So what are you saying?" Vincent asked. "I'm saying that justice is slow. I'm saying that even with this evidence, there's no guarantee of prosecution, much less conviction. And I'm saying that Mrs. Whitmore needs to be prepared for a long fight." I don't care how long it takes, Eleanor said firmly. I'll fight as long as I need to. Holt nodded. That's what I needed to hear. Agent Garrison will take your formal statement and we'll arrange protective custody if you feel you're in danger from Apex Ridge. She's already got protection, Clayton rumbled. 15 men who've made it clear they're not going anywhere. Holt's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Unconventional, but I won't argue with results. Mrs. Whitmore is still alive and here to testify, which suggests your methods are effective. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything in exhaustive detail. Agent Garrison recorded Eleanor's statement, photographed every page of Garrett's ledger, took contact information for all the potential witnesses in Auburn. She made calls, activated resources, started the machinery of federal investigation grinding into motion. Iris Brennan was allowed in to observe and take notes, and Vincent could see her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard, already crafting the story that would expose Apex Ridge to public scrutiny, even if the legal process took years. It was almost noon when they finally finished, and Vincent's phone had been buzzing periodically with texts from the wolves outside, asking if everything was okay. He was about to respond when Agent Garrison's phone rang. She answered, listened for a moment, and her expression went cold. We have a situation, she said, hanging up. Apex Ridge's legal team just showed up downstairs. They're demanding to speak with Mrs. Whitmore, and they've brought what they claim are court-ordered psychiatric evaluation papers. Vincent was on his feet instantly. They can't take her. They can't, Garrison agreed. Not from federal custody, but they can make a lot of noise, and if they've got legitimate court orders, it complicates things. Those orders are fake, Eleanor said, her voice shaking, or obtained under false pretenses. I've never been evaluated by any psychiatrist. Sterling manufactured all of it. I believe you, Garrison said, but we need to handle this carefully. Let me go down and see what they've got. You stay here. You're safe in this building. She left again, and Vincent moved to the window. 5 stories up, he could see the parking lot across the street where the wolves waited with their bikes. And pulling in now 3 black sedans, expensive and identical, disgorging men in suits who moved with the precision of a military unit. Sterling Webb emerged from the lead car, and even from this distance, Vincent could see the cold fury in his body language. He'd lost control of the situation, lost his ability to quietly make Eleanor disappear, and now he was here to reassert dominance the only way he knew how. Through lawyers and paperwork and the legal system that could be twisted and manipulated if you had enough money and connections. Clayton saw them too. Vincent watched as Bulldog stood up from where he'd been sitting on his bike, watched as the other wolves formed a loose line between the FBI building entrance and the Apex Ridge contingent. Not aggressive, not threatening, just present. A reminder that Eleanor had protection. One of the suited men from Apex tried to push past the wolves. Chain, the lean redhead with the scar, simply stepped into his path and crossed his arms. The man tried to go around. Another wolf blocked him. It was like watching water try to flow through stone. Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from Clayton. They're trying to get inside. We're not letting them past us without a fight. Vincent texted back quickly. Don't start anything. FBI has her. She's safe. Just make sure they know we're not going anywhere. Copy that. Agent Garrison returned 10 minutes later, looking irritated. Sterling Webb is downstairs with 5 lawyers and a stack of paperwork 3 inches thick. They're claiming Mrs. Whitmore is mentally incompetent and that she's been kidnapped by a motorcycle gang. They want her released into their custody immediately for psychiatric evaluation. That's insane, Vincent said. It's strategy, Iris interjected from her laptop. Classic intimidation tactic. Flood the system with so much legal noise that it becomes easier to just give in than to fight. I've seen it a dozen times with elder abuse cases. What did you tell them? Eleanor asked, her voice small. I told them to get the hell out of my building, Garrison said flatly, and that if they had actual legitimate court orders, they could file them with the appropriate channels, and we'd review them through proper procedure. Which they won't do because my guess is those orders are fraudulent or obtained through perjury. She sat down across from Eleanor again. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there any part of you, any doubt at all, that makes you think maybe they're right? That maybe you are confused or not remembering things correctly? Eleanor looked her straight in the eye. Agent Garrison, I am 73 years old. I have arthritis in my hands and my knees hurt when it rains. And I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. But I remember every single word of the conversation Garrett and I had the night before he died. I remember him telling me he was afraid, but he had to do the right thing. I remember the exact shade of blue the sky was the day they buried him. And I remember every number in that ledger because I've read it so many times I could recite it in my sleep. She leaned forward. I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am a woman who watched her husband get murdered, and I will not let his death be for nothing. So no, Agent Garrison. There is no doubt. Garrison nodded slowly. Good, because this is about to get ugly, and I need you to be absolutely certain. It got ugly faster than Vincent expected. By 2 in the afternoon, Apex Ridge had mobilized a full legal assault. They'd gotten a local judge to issue an emergency custody order based on their fraudulent psychiatric evaluations, and now they were demanding that the FBI either charge Eleanor with a crime or release her into their custody. They'd also filed a restraining order against the Iron Wolves claiming harassment and intimidation. Agent Holt was furious but constrained by procedure and jurisdiction. The FBI could protect Eleanor while she was actively cooperating with an investigation, but they couldn't hold her indefinitely against court orders, even suspect ones. And challenging the orders would take time, would require lawyers and hearings and all the machinery of the legal system that moved at glacial pace. We need to move her, Holt said grimly. Get her somewhere safe while we sort out the legal issues. Do you have anywhere she can go? Somewhere Apex doesn't know about. Vincent thought fast. Silas's church was compromised now, too obvious. Eleanor's home was out of the question. They needed somewhere off the grid, somewhere that wouldn't show up in any database or property record. The clubhouse, Clayton said. Iron Wolves compound outside of Reno. It's private property heavily secured, and there's no paper trail connecting Eleanor to it. She could stay there while the FBI works on getting the court orders overturned. Holt looked skeptical. You want me to put a federal witness in the custody of a motorcycle club? You got a better option, Clayton asked. Because from where I'm standing, we're the only ones who've managed to keep her alive this long. Holt and Garrison exchanged a look, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, Holt sighed. All right, but Agent Garrison goes with you. Official FBI presence, make sure everything stays above board. And Mrs. Whitmore, you call me every day. Check in, let me know you're safe. Can you do that? Yes, Eleanor said, whatever it takes. They made plans quickly. The Wolves would create a diversion, make it look like they were escorting Eleanor out the front entrance, while actually she and Agent Garrison would leave through the underground parking garage in an unmarked FBI vehicle. Once they were clear, the bikes would catch up on the road to Reno. Vincent didn't like splitting up, didn't like the idea of Eleanor being anywhere he couldn't personally protect her, but the logic was sound. Apex would follow, the bikes would expect Eleanor to be with them, and by the time they realized she wasn't, it would be too late. They went over the plan 3 times, making sure everyone understood their role. Then Vincent pulled Eleanor aside for a private word. You trust me, he asked. With my life, she said without hesitation. Then trust me now. Trust Clayton and the others. We'll get you to safety, and then we'll make sure Apex Ridge pays for what they did to Garrett and everyone else. Eleanor reached up and cupped his bearded cheek with one small hand, the gesture so reminiscent of his own grandmother that Vincent felt his throat tighten. You're a good man, Vincent Callahan, she said softly. Your wife knew that. Your brother knows it. And now I know it too. Whatever happens, thank you for giving an old woman hope again. Vincent could only nod, not trusting his voice. They executed the plan at 3 o'clock. The Wolves made a big show of leaving through the front entrance, engines roaring, and leather-clad bodies forming a protective box around an empty space where Eleanor should have been. Apex Ridge's people took the bait, their sedans pulling out to follow the motorcycles as they headed east out of downtown. Vincent rode in the middle of the pack, hyper-aware of the tail behind them, watching in his mirrors as the black cars kept pace. They led them on a chase through Sacramento's streets out onto the highway, maintaining just enough speed to keep them interested, but not enough to trigger a police response. 30 minutes outside the city, Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Garrison. Clear. En route to Reno. ETA 5 hours. He showed the message to Clayton at the next stoplight. Bulldog grinned and gave a thumbs up, then revved his engine and shot forward. The Wolves followed, abandoning any pretense of having Eleanor with them and opening up their throttles, leaving the Apex Ridge tail struggling to keep up with bikes that could do twice the speed limit when they wanted to. They lost the sedans somewhere near Roseville, the bikes scattering in different directions before regrouping on a back road that wound through Gold Country foothills. When they were certain they'd shaken pursuit, they turned north toward Reno, taking the long way through mountain passes and small towns where strangers would be noticed and reported. The sun was setting by the time they reached the Iron Wolves compound, a collection of buildings on 20 acres of scrubland outside Reno proper. It was secured with high fences and cameras and wolves who took security seriously, and when Vincent rolled through the gate, he felt some of the tension in his shoulders finally ease. Agent Garrison's car was already there, parked near the main clubhouse. Eleanor sat on the porch drinking coffee and talking with Silas, who'd driven up from Auburn to be with her. She looked exhausted but safe, and when she saw Vincent, her whole face lit up. "We made it," she said, wonder in her voice. "We actually made it." "We made it," Vincent confirmed, climbing off his bike and stretching muscles sore from hours in the saddle. "Now we wait while the FBI builds their case." But waiting, it turned out, wouldn't take as long as anyone expected. Iris Brennan published her article the next morning. It went viral within hours. The headline read, "The Apex Predator, How One Company Hunted Seniors for Millions." And beneath it was Eleanor's photograph, Garrett's story, and a scathing indictment of Apex Ridge Development's decades of fraud. Iris had worked through the night, pulling together everything Eleanor had shared, everything the Auburn victims had testified, to everything she'd been able to confirm through public records and previous investigative work. The story named names: Conrad Breckenridge, CEO, Sterling Webb attorney, and Breckenridge's son-in-law, married to the daughter who ran Apex Marketing Division. A family enterprise built on stealing from the elderly, protected by lawyers and money, and the assumption that their victims would be too ashamed or too dead to fight back. By noon, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet. By evening, it was trending on social media, shared hundreds of thousands of times by people outraged that anyone could prey on seniors so systematically. By midnight, there were calls for congressional investigations, for criminal prosecutions, for justice. And then Conrad Breckenridge made a mistake. He went on television to defend himself, appeared on the evening news with his silver hair perfectly styled in his expensive suit, carefully chosen to project trustworthiness. He called Eleanor a confused widow, and Iris's article irresponsible journalism, and claimed that Apex Ridge had always operated with complete integrity. He said that Garrett Whitmore had been a troubled employee with substance abuse issues, and that his death was a tragic accident that had nothing to do with the company. He smiled at the camera and said he welcomed any investigation because Apex Ridge had nothing to hide. And Eleanor, watching from the clubhouse in Reno, with Vincent and Silas beside her, felt rage burn through her grief for the first time. "He's calling Garrett a drunk," she said, her voice shaking. "A liar. After everything Garrett did for that company and all those years of loyal service, he's destroying his reputation to save himself." "Let him," Silas said quietly. "Let him dig his own grave with lies. Because we have the truth, and the truth always wins eventually." The truth came in pieces over the next week. Agent Garrison and her team executed search warrants on Apex Ridge's offices, seizing computers and files and financial records. They interviewed employees, many of whom, faced with FBI agents and the threat of prison time, suddenly remembered things they'd been encouraged to forget. Irregularities, falsified documents, instructions from Conrad to hide certain transactions. They found the mechanic who'd serviced Garrett's car 2 weeks before his death. He confirmed the brakes had been in perfect working order. He also remembered a man coming by the shop the day before Garrett died, asking questions about the car, claiming to be a friend of the family. The mechanic's security camera had captured the man's face. It was one of Sterling Webb's enforcers. They exhumed Garrett's car from the impound lot where it had been sitting for 7 months. Forensic examination revealed evidence of tampering, minute scratches on the brake line, consistent with deliberate cutting. Someone had sabotaged the brakes, made it look like gradual failure, when in fact they'd been designed to fail catastrophically at speed. Garrett Whitmore had been murdered. The arrest warrants were issued on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Eleanor had walked into that diner and asked Vincent for help. FBI agents took Conrad Breckenridge into custody at his home, walked him out in handcuffs past cameras that broadcast his humiliation to millions. Sterling Webb was arrested at his office, along with 3 of his enforcers who'd participated in the intimidation campaign against Eleanor. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, securities fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and for Conrad and Sterling, murder in the commission of a felony. Eleanor watched the arrests on television, Vincent and Silas on either side of her, and finally it allowed herself to cry. Not tears of fear or grief this time, but tears of relief. Justice, slow and imperfect as it was, had finally caught up with the men who'd killed her husband. The trial took 14 months. Eleanor testified for 3 days, walking the jury through Garrett's investigation, the threats she'd received, her desperate flight, and the help she'd found from strangers who became family. She presented Garrett's ledger, explained every entry, showed them the trail of stolen money. The Auburn victims testified. Walter Grimshaw speaking for Dottie, who couldn't speak for herself. Alice and Frank in the Hendersons, and dozens more telling stories of trust betrayed and savings stolen. Beth Harper testified about Jared's death, about the safety violations and the NDA that had kept her silent for 3 years out of fear and shame. Agent Garrison testified about the evidence of tampering, the murder disguised as accident, the systematic pattern of fraud going back over a decade. And Iris Brennan's article was entered into evidence, a roadmap for the jury showing exactly how Apex Ridge had operated and who had known what when. The defense tried to paint Eleanor as confused, vindictive, a woman whose grief had twisted into paranoia. They tried to suggest Garrett had been embezzling and his accusations were projection. They tried to claim the brake failure was coincidental, that there was no proof of murder. The jury didn't believe any of it. Conrad Breckenridge was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. He'd be 90 years old before he was eligible for parole, and everyone in the courtroom knew he'd die behind bars. Sterling Webb got 15 years. His wife divorced him before the sentencing reclaimed her maiden name and publicly apologized to all of Apex Ridge's victims. The enforcers who'd helped got 7 years each for conspiracy and obstruction, and Apex Ridge Development was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the victims. $23 million recovered. 317 victims compensated, most of them receiving back everything they'd lost, plus interest and damages. It wasn't enough to undo the harm. Couldn't bring back Garrett or Jared or the years of security that had been stolen. But it was something. It was justice, imperfect and slow but real. The day after the sentencing, Eleanor established the Garrett Whitmore Elder Protection Fund with money from the victim, compensation, and donations that poured in from people who'd read Iris's article and wanted to help. The fund provided free legal aid to seniors facing financial abuse, education about scams and fraud, and support for families trying to protect vulnerable elderly members. Silas's church became the fund's headquarters, and Eleanor moved into a small house 2 blocks away. She spent her days answering calls from seniors who needed help, connecting them with lawyers and investigators and resources. Spent her evenings in the church fellowship hall, teaching financial literacy classes and warning people about the red flags of fraud. She was 74 years old and busier than she'd been in decades, and for the first time since Garrett died, she felt like she had a purpose beyond just surviving. Vincent settled in Auburn, too. He'd gone back to Reno after Eleanor was safe, intending to return to his solitary life of long rides and longer silences. But Silas had called him a week later and asked if he'd consider staying, helping with the fund, maybe opening a motorcycle shop in town where he could work with his hands and be close to family. It had taken Vincent 3 days to make the decision, 3 days of riding aimlessly through the Nevada desert and thinking about Catherine and promises and second chances. On the 4th day, he'd called Silas back and said yes. The shop opened 6 months later, a small garage on the edge of town where Vincent did custom work and repairs and taught kids from the community how to work on engines. He hired 2 employees, both former Apex Ridge workers who'd lost their jobs when the company dissolved, men who needed a second chance and were grateful for someone who'd give them one. The Iron Wolves adopted Auburn as a regular stop on their runs. The locals got used to seeing motorcycles in the church parking lot. On Sunday mornings, leather-clad bikers sitting in the pews and singing hymns off-key. Got used to seeing Eleanor riding in Vincent's sidecar around town, the tiny elderly woman, and the massive biker who'd become as close as any blood family. Clayton visited monthly, always made a point of having coffee with Eleanor and catching her up on club news. The other wolves who'd been there that first night at the Starlight Diner came through too, one by one, or in groups, checking on the woman they'd helped save and making sure she knew she was still under their protection. Beth Harper moved to Auburn a year after the trial, took a job as office manager for the Garrett Whitmore Fund. She and Eleanor became close friends, 2 widows bound together by shared loss and the determination to make something good come from their grief. Agent Garrison was promoted to head of the white-collar crime division. She sent Eleanor a handwritten note thanking her for her courage, saying that the Apex Ridge case had led to 3 other investigations into elder fraud schemes. Eleanor kept the note on her desk, read it whenever she needed a reminder that speaking up had mattered. Iris Brennan won another Pulitzer for her coverage of the case. She used her award speech to talk about Eleanor's courage and the importance of believing victims, especially elderly victims, who were so often dismissed and ignored. The speech was played millions of times online, and Eleanor received letters from seniors all over the country thanking her for giving them hope. And Vincent and Silas brothers, who'd been estranged for 6 years, rebuilt their relationship slowly and carefully. They had dinner together every Thursday night, sometimes just the 2 of them, sometimes with Eleanor and Beth joining them. They talked about their parents, about Catherine, and about the ways grief had twisted them both into shapes they didn't recognize until someone came along and helped them remember who they really were. Silas stopped trying to convert Vincent back to faith. Vincent stopped resenting Silas for having answers he didn't. They just learned to be brothers again, to support each other, to show up when it mattered. 2 years after that night at the Starlight Diner, the Auburn community held a ceremony to dedicate a memorial plaque outside Calvary Baptist Church. It read, "In memory of Garrett Whitmore and all who stand for truth when silence would be easier." Eleanor stood in front of the plaque with Vincent on one side and Silas on the other, surrounded by the Iron Wolves and the Auburn victims, and people from all over who'd come to honor a man they'd never met, but whose courage had inspired them. She placed her hand on the bronze and felt the warmth of the sun-heated metal beneath her palm, and she could almost feel Garrett standing beside her, proud of what she'd done, proud that his death hadn't been for nothing. "We did it, love," she whispered. "We made them pay. We told the truth." Vincent heard her and put his arm around her shoulders. This woman who'd chosen to trust him in her darkest moment, who'd given him a reason to start living again when he'd been sleepwalking through life for 3 years. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for walking into that diner, for asking for help, for reminding me what matters." Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that were still sharp despite her years. "Thank you for saying yes, for being exactly who I needed, exactly when I needed him." The ceremony ended with a ride 60 motorcycles and twice as many passengers, a convoy of Iron Wolves and community members and people who'd come together because one elderly woman had refused to be silenced and one biker had refused to look away when someone needed help. They rode through Auburn streets with engines rumbling like thunder, a declaration that justice was possible, that courage mattered, that ordinary people could stand up to power and win if they stood together. Vincent rode at the front with Eleanor in his sidecar, her white hair flying in the wind and her face lit up with joy. Silas rode behind them on a borrowed bike, his first time on a motorcycle, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The wolves surrounded them, a wall of brotherhood and protection that would never falter. And somewhere in the wind and the engine's roar and the warmth of the sun, Vincent felt Catherine's presence like a benediction. Felt her approval, her love, her pride in the man he'd become. He'd kept his promise after all. He'd kept living. He'd let things matter. He'd become someone who stood up when it counted, who helped people who needed help, who made a difference in the world. And that he thought as Auburn streets gave way to open highway and the convoy picked up speed, that was exactly what Catherine had always believed he could be. A man with a big heart and a strong back. A man who showed up when it mattered. A man who knew that sometimes the biggest thing you could do was stand beside someone who needed you and refused to let them fall. Vincent twisted the throttle and the Harley surged forward, carrying him and Eleanor and all the people who'd become family into whatever came next. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but they'd face it together, and that made all the difference.